My name is Yumi. I was born near the sea, in a city where winter wind could slice through your coat and still carry the smell of salt. People say the water keeps secrets. I learned early that families do too. My mother sewed hymns for other women's lives, uniforms, school skirts, the occasional wedding dress, while I learned to measure time by the sound of her machine. My father measured time differently, by debts that arrived like weather and left like fathers do in stories you don't want to tell. We moved to Seoul when I was 17, into a room so small the rice cooker warmed the whole place. The city felt like a promise if you looked from far away, and like a test if you looked up close. I looked up close. I took the first job I found, then the second, and by the third, I had memorized how to make my face look awake on 3 hours of sleep. In those days, my dreams were practical. A real door that locked, a phone that wasn't prepaid, a mother who didn't flinch when the landlord knocked. People imagine turning points are loud. Mine was quiet. A night bus, a neon alley, a woman in a clean coat who said she could introduce me to a place that paid cash, same day. It's just serving drinks, she said. It was at first. You pour, you smile, you laugh at jokes that aren't funny, and you learn to keep the table in your control. Men don't notice how much power there is in deciding where the ashtray goes. I told myself I was only there to climb out of a hole. Holes are honest. They never pretend to be anything else. What changes is the voice in your head. At the beginning it says, just for a while. Later it says, you're good at this. Eventually it whispers, what else could you do? The first time someone asked, how much for an hour after? I felt my stomach answer before my mouth did. Not with yes, just with the cold math of rent due in 2 days, and my mother's cough getting worse, and the landlord tapping the railing with his key like a metronome. I said no that night. I went home and counted my money twice, as if the bills might multiply if I stared long enough. They didn't. The next week I said yes. I wish I could tell you I cried, that the sky broke open, that violins played the exact note of my shame. What happened was smaller. I put cash in an envelope for my mother's clinic visit, bought a second-hand coat that was finally warm, and slept through until my alarm for the first time in months. There are rules you learn quickly in my line of work. Never drink what you didn't watch poured. Shoes you can run in, even if they look delicate. Share your location with a girl who will wake up to check it. Don't give a real name unless you plan to keep a real life with that person, which you won't. And a secret rule. Build a self that can sit beside you and do the talking while the rest of you stays somewhere safe. I kept lists to feel orderly, groceries, clinic hours, phrases that let a man save face while I saved mine. I learned how to read the room by the tilt of a glass, the weight of a pause, the way a wallet appears before a boundary disappears. I learned that some men want power and others want permission to put their loneliness somewhere it won't be seen. Either way they leave, and the room smells like cologne and coins. If you're looking for villains in my story, you won't find them wearing capes. You'll find rent and illness and school fees and the price of a life inside a city that charges for air. You'll find a daughter who grew up counting the ways to make a week last 9 days. You'll find a mother who hid her cough because pride is cheaper than medicine, until it isn't. In the apartment, I kept the envelopes in a blue box under the sink. Money for electricity. Money for mother. Money for leaving someday I couldn't name. I told myself I was building a bridge. I told myself bridges are beautiful, even while you're still on the scaffolding, and the river below looks like it's yawning open. There was a man who came often and never touched. He bought an hour to talk about his failure like it was a favorite novel. He said I listened well. I said very little. He taught me something I didn't expect. People will pay for gentleness because they don't know where else to find it. I stored that fact beside the others I collected for later. Later is a real place if you keep it fed. When the shame came, it didn't wear horns. It came in ordinary ways. A neighbor's question I dodged, a cousin's wedding I skipped, a mirror I wiped without looking up. It came when my mother called me by a pet name and asked if I could bring home mandarins. And I said yes, and she said, Only if they're on sale, and I said, I can afford mandarins now. And she said nothing for a long breath that meant she was counting what my yes might cost. I learned to walk different streets to the subway. I bought a cheap wig for the nights I needed to be someone else. I kept a small notebook in my bag and wrote a single true sentence after each shift. I am still me. Sometimes that felt like a lie. Sometimes it felt like a key I hadn't found the lock for yet. On Sundays I went to the river, the one that divides the city like a scar, and I stood on a bridge and watched the water write and rewrite itself. I imagined tossing my phone in and starting over. I imagined a kitchen with the morning sun in it and 2 bowls set out and no counting. I imagined the version of me who lived there and wondered what her voice sounded like when she laughed. I'm not going to tell you I loved the work or hated it. Both are too simple. I respected what it required: vigilance, performance, the steady refusal to become. By the time she turned 22, Yumi knew how to disappear in plain sight. Seoul rewarded that kind of skill. A city built on movement, on eyes that slid past one another without seeing. She worked at a place with pink lights that flickered over the mirrors, a bar that smelled of citrus and smoke. The girls there traded small tricks of survival like currency: how to smile without invitation, how to read the air when a man's tone shifted, how to make laughter sound like armor. She lived above a convenience store in a room so narrow she could touch both walls at once. The hum of the refrigerators below became her lullaby. On the wall, a calendar marked her months in red circles: rent days, hospital appointments, her mother's treatments. Under the sink, the blue box kept growing heavier with folded bills and quiet hopes. Work blurred the days. Faces drinks stories. Men who called her angel and darling, and someone who listens. Their loneliness came packaged in aftershave and apology. One said he was building a business, another said he'd lost one. All wanted something to hold without having to keep it. One regular came every Friday. Mr. Han, his suit never wrinkled. His eyes always did. He'd talk about his son in America, about how success was colder than he expected. Sometimes he'd forget his lighter, and she kept each one in a drawer like trophies: gold, silver, black, proof that she existed somewhere beyond the neon. Her mother's voice came through the phone each Sunday, fragile but proud. She spoke of the neighbor's new grandchild, the doctor's new medicine, never of the cough that still rattled through her chest. Yumi never told her where the money came from. Some truths lived safer inside silence. The longer she worked, the better she became at separating herself. One smiled and poured drinks. The other hid behind her eyes, counting minutes until dawn. When the men left, she'd wash her hands until the water ran cold, trying to remove fingerprints that weren't really there. Once a fight broke out in the corridor. Shouts, glass breaking, a girl crying. The manager barked for them to keep smiling. She did. Later, she found a lipstick-smeared ID card on the floor. 19 years old, she folded it in her palm, felt the edges cut her skin, and slipped it into her bag. A reminder. That night, she almost packed her things. She emptied the blue box, counted enough for a train ticket, and stared at the window until sunrise. But when her mother called the next morning asking for help with another bill, she placed the money back. The choice felt like gravity. Days bled into weeks. One evening, a man with a camera came in, a freelance photographer named Min. He said her face looked like something worth remembering. She said memory was overrated, but he returned and kept returning until she found herself waiting for him. He took her for coffee, never touched her. He talked about light, about finding beauty in broken places. She wanted to believe he saw her that way. Not what she did, but what she could have been. They met at the river one afternoon, and he asked to take her portrait. She wore a white dress she'd bought second-hand and stood with the wind in her hair. When he said smile, it felt like the first honest command she'd ever received. For a while, she imagined another version of her life, a small apartment filled with plants, mornings with sunlight instead of smoke. She stopped working nights for a week just to see if the city would notice. It didn't. But she felt lighter anyway. Then everything unraveled. Someone recognized her from the club and told him. The next time he called, his voice was sharp, cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. She had no answer. "You lied," he said. She didn't. She just never said the words he didn't want to hear. He stopped coming. The photo he took by the river stayed taped to her mirror for 3 days before she tore it in half. The smile looked like it belonged to someone else. She went back to work the next night. The lights were too bright, the laughter too loud. A man asked her name. She said, "Hannah," a name that meant flower and also one, something whole, something alone. When the shift ended, she stood outside while snow fell onto the empty street. The flakes melted on her hands like tiny ghosts. She thought about all the versions of herself scattered across this city. The girl who believed, the woman who endured, the daughter who still sent money home. None of them fit entirely, yet all of them breathed. In the quiet, she whispered to no one, "I'm still here." No prayer, no plea, just a statement of fact. The buses started again at dawn. She pulled her coat tighter, walked toward the bridge, and waited for the first light to hit the river. The city woke up behind her, restless, hungry, alive. She took one slow breath, then another. The air was sharp, but it didn't cut. That was enough. Spring came late that year, the kind that arrives without ceremony. A pale sun, damp air, the sound of street sweepers brushing away winter. Yumi moved through the season like a ghost with a schedule. Work, home, sleep. The bar had changed names again. New owner, new girls, same rules. She told herself she'd stop soon. She said it every month, like a prayer made to no one in particular. The blue box under the sink still waited. So did the rent, the hospital bills, the debts. She didn't hate her life. She just didn't know how to step outside of it. Sometimes, she'd sit by the small window of her apartment and watch the city move. Couples hurrying with umbrellas, delivery bikes slicing through puddles, students laughing into their phones. She felt both inside and outside of all of it, like a shadow that forgot who it belonged to. One night, a new girl arrived at the bar. Barely 19, soft-voiced, eyes too trusting. Her name was Sora. The manager told Yumi to show her how things worked. So she did. How to pour without spilling, how to dodge wandering hands with a joke, how to walk away before a smile became a promise. Sora reminded her of herself, years ago. The same hesitation in her movements, the same polite apologies for taking up space. "You'll get used to it," Yumi said, though she hoped she wouldn't. Later that week, they shared a taxi home. Sora talked about dreams, studying design, traveling, saving money to move out of the country. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the floor beside the blue box, her knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't crying. The fear had become something colder, a kind of alertness that never left. When her mother died 2 months later, it happened quietly. A neighbor called. She didn't suffer, the woman said, as if that mattered. Yumi went home for the funeral, a small village she hadn't seen in years. The sea smelled the same, but the air carried judgment. Relatives whispered. No one asked what she did in the city. Everyone already knew. Her mother's hands were folded neatly on her chest. Yumi placed the mandarins beside the coffin, the last thing her mother had ever asked her to bring. The skin of the fruit glowed under the dim temple light. She wanted to say something, but her throat stayed dry. After the funeral, she stayed in the house for 2 days, sleeping on the floor, listening to the silence press against the walls. It wasn't peace. It was absence. When she returned to Seoul, she couldn't go back to work. Not right away. The bar's noise felt foreign, like a language she'd forgotten. She spent days wandering through markets, parks, subway stations, anywhere she could blend into movement. One afternoon, she found herself in front of an art supply store. Inside, rows of colors waited like new beginnings. Pencils, paints, brushes. Without thinking, she bought a sketchbook. The first page stayed blank for days, then weeks. Eventually, she drew, not people, but fragments. A hand reaching, a glass half full, the shape of a bridge. Small things that didn't demand to be pretty. She realized that in drawing, she could decide what stayed and what disappeared. She could build a world where no one touched without permission. When she finally returned to work, the bar felt smaller. The girls asked where she'd been. Home, she said simply. No one pressed further. Everyone there understood that sometimes you vanish a little before you come back. Summer arrived heavy and wet, pressing against every window pane, like the city itself was sweating. Yumi found work at a small motel near the river, cleaning rooms, folding towels, scrubbing away other people's nights. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and the quiet felt sacred. The hum of the washing machines became her music now. Each bed she made was a small act of control, a place where things could finally stay in their proper shape. The manager, a woman named Mrs. Cho, didn't ask questions. She paid cash, on Fridays, in small envelopes that Yumi didn't have to hide. There was something soothing about the predictability. Rooms 204 through 210 on Mondays, linens on Tuesdays, kitchen help on weekends. She liked how the world shrank to simple tasks she could finish. No pretending, no men watching her reflection in the mirror. Just soap, water, and time. Some nights she walked home along the river, the same one she used to stare at from the bridge years ago. The city lights shimmered on the surface, and she would think, I am still here. Not proud, not ashamed, just existing. Survival had become its own kind of rhythm. At 28, she was learning what silence could hold. It wasn't empty. It was thick with all the things she hadn't said. She still thought about her mother sometimes, about the way her hands trembled when folding laundry, about the sound of her sewing machine that had once been the heartbeat of their home. Those memories used to sting. Now they sat beside her quietly, like old friends who didn't need to speak. One morning, while cleaning room 306, she found a sketchbook left behind. The cover was worn, edges frayed. Inside were charcoal drawings, faces, bodies, cityscapes. But one sketch stopped her. A woman sitting on a bridge, staring at water. Her own posture, her own loneliness. Some days passed, then weeks. Her small apartment slowly filled with drawings, not of faces, but of hands, windows, empty chairs, places where people had just left. The act itself became a kind of prayer. She didn't draw to forget. She drew to remember differently. Then one evening, a girl checked into the motel. Maybe 20, maybe younger. Too much makeup, too little luggage. Yumi saw the way her eyes scanned the room, cautious, calculating. She recognized it instantly, the look of someone who had already learned too much. Later, when Yumi brought clean towels, she noticed the girl's hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. You don't have to stay here, Yumi said quietly. The girl looked up startled. Where else would I go? Yumi didn't have an answer. She just left the towels and said, if you need anything, my shift ends at 10. The girl never came to find her, but the next day, her room was empty, the bed unmade, a single hair tie left on the nightstand. Yumi slipped it into her pocket. That night she sat by the window and looked at the skyline, the glass towers, the blinking signs, the endless hum. It all felt both cruel and forgiving. She realized she wasn't running anymore. Not from men, not from her past, not even from herself. She was standing still, finally seeing what remained. A few months later, the man with the sketchbook came back again. He asked if she'd let him draw her. Not like that, he said quickly. Just as you are, working. She hesitated, then agreed. He came during her break, setting up quietly in the corner as she folded sheets. The sound of charcoal scratching filled the room. By the time she turned 35, Seoul no longer frightened her. It had stopped being a maze of danger and noise and become, somehow, a living map of everything she had survived. She could walk past old bars, old streets, even the bridge by the river, and not feel like she was about to vanish. The ghosts were still there, yes, but they were quiet now. Her booth at the market had grown into a small studio, tucked between a tailor and a flower shop. The window faced east, so the first light of every morning spilled across her sketches before it touched anything else. She liked that. The idea that color saw her work before people did. She painted in silence mostly. Faces without names, hands holding air, windows cracked open just enough for light to escape. Her paintings didn't sell for much, but they traveled. A cafe owner hung one by his counter. A teacher bought another for her classroom. A woman from Busan wrote her a letter saying one of Yumi's drawings had helped her stop crying for the first time in months. It wasn't fame, but it was something gentler, proof of connection. On weekends, her sister visited from the coast. They'd walk by the river and talk about everything except the past. One afternoon, her sister said quietly, "You know, when I think of us as children, I don't see pain anymore. I see two girls who refuse to die." Yumi smiled. Maybe that's the truest version of us. They laughed then, real laughter. The kind that didn't sound like defense. Still, the nights carried echoes. There were moments when she woke to phantom footsteps, or smelled the faint trace of whiskey and cologne in her dreams. Trauma she'd learned it doesn't vanish. It just becomes background noise, like traffic outside a window you eventually stop hearing. When those nights came, she'd get up, light a candle, and draw until morning. It was her way of reminding the dark who she had become. Her studio began to attract other women, quiet visitors who came not to buy, but to breathe. They'd stand in front of her work and whisper things like, "It feels like me." Yumi started keeping tea on the counter for them. Some cried, some just stood silently, staring at the paintings until they were ready to leave. One woman came often, mid-40s, neatly dressed, eyes red-rimmed but kind. She never spoke. That night, she wrote those words on a scrap of paper and pinned them above her desk. "I just stopped fighting it." A few months later, the city held a small art exhibition for local women. A curator visited her studio and asked if she'd like to participate. Yumi hesitated. The idea of being seen still made her uneasy. But something in her shifted. For so many years, her life had been hidden. Maybe visibility was its own rebellion. She chose 6 paintings, mostly quiet scenes. A woman brushing her hair by candlelight, an empty chair beside a window, a pair of hands submerged in water. On opening night, she wore a pale blue dress, her hair in a loose bun. The gallery lights were bright but soft. People moved slowly, whispering. Someone asked her, "What do you call this collection?" She said, "The shape of light." The man nodded. "Why light?" "Because it always finds a way in," she answered. As she stood there, surrounded by her own work, she felt something she hadn't known in decades. Calm pride. Not the trembling kind that needed approval, but the quiet, knowing that her pain had turned into something that could stand on its own. Near the end of the evening, her sister arrived with a bouquet of white lilies. "You did it," she said, tears brimming. Yumi smiled. "We did." They sat together after the guests left, the gallery empty except for the echo of footsteps and the faint hum of lights. Yumi looked at her painting of the hands in water, the one she'd nearly thrown away. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked. Her sister shook her head. "Not anymore." Yumi nodded. "Me neither."